Sit very still and listen. Is your heart beating in this same rhythm? You are experiencing the heartbeat of a dying man. And it is with death and dying that we concern ourselves. What happens at the point of death? What happens afterwards?
From the very start, Edgar Allan Poe's life was dramatic and confused. He was born in Boston in January 1809, the second child of actors David and Elizabeth Poe. David Poe had begun his adult life as a law student, but gave up his studies to go on the stage. Whether his talent merited the move is hard to say, but the family certainly was very poor. We know little more of David Poe, except that he disappeared in 1810. Either he died, or he ran off with another woman. Elizabeth Poe was left in Boston with 2 children, and expecting a third. The eldest boy, William, was adopted by relatives, but taking Edgar along, she went on working as and where she could, up and down the country. Apart from the difficulties of her pregnancy, she was already suffering from tuberculosis. While working in Norfolk, Virginia, she gave birth to her daughter Rosalie, and had to go on working to support the 2 children. Elizabeth Poe died at the beginning of December 1811.
Eliza Poe was just 24. Edgar was 3 years old.
Fortunately, she was not without friends who were concerned about the plight of her children. Edgar went with a Mrs. Frances Allan, and Rosalie with Mrs. Allan's friend, Mrs. Mackenzie. It was a lucky chance for the 2 children, for the families were well off and well able to care for them. Allan had plans to expand his business in London, and taking his family along with him, he sailed for England in 1815, when Poe was about 6 years old. They settled in Bloomsbury, in comfortable lodgings, but the London of 1815, with the Napoleonic Wars just over, was an expensive place, and Allan's business affairs did not prosper. Back in Richmond in 1820, after the failure of his English ventures, Allan was almost bankrupt. With the help of his uncle Galt, he survived. For Edgar, it was the best time of his life. He grew up in every respect. He became an excellent swimmer, for example, here in the James River, pictured today a mile or 2 above the town. Jane Stannard, the beautiful mother of one of his school friends, lived in the large house pictured here at the back of the Capitol building. Poe developed a passion for her, and when she suddenly died in 1824, he was devastated. She inspired one of his best-known poems, written in later years, To Helen. He was already at 15, precocious and reading and writing poetry. Early in 1825, Thomas Jefferson realized his dream of establishing a new university for Virginia, and in the buildings he designed, teaching began. In 1826, Edgar Allan Poe joined the new intake of 177 students. He was 17 and bent on being a professional writer. Poe eventually settled in this room in the block known as West Range. Here, Poe studied and struggled with the problems which began to beset him. From the very first week, he got into debt because the money John Allan had given him was not enough to cover the initial expenses of the school. But as Allan's son, he got credit easily enough. When Allan did not send more money, Poe gambled, as everyone else did, and ran up more debts. Not doubting that Allan would pay in the end, he spent freely on clothes and entertainments, and before long he was head over heels in difficulties. It was from this time that he had a reputation for being a drunkard, something that dogged him for the rest of his life. It seems that in fact very little alcohol produced in him disastrous effects. At the end of his first year, Allan brought him home, paid the most pressing bills, and more or less made it clear that from then on Poe would have to fend for himself.
The Allens never formally adopted Poe, and he resented that. He always wanted to take over the Allen name. He never felt comfortable with it. We call him Edgar Allan Poe, but he only went so far as to call himself Edgar A. Poe. I mean, he suggesting that he both wanted the name, but really felt that it didn't belong to him. It was only after Poe's death that he began to be called Edgar Allan Poe.
Poe's relationship to his foster mother, Frances, was close but short-lived. When Edgar was 20, she died of TB.
Poe began to see himself as a kind of cursed figure, someone who actually brought misfortune on especially women he loved. And all of this produces in Poe's work a kind of brooding awareness of mortality.
From the beginning, death haunted Poe. At the age of 27, left by his father, bereft by the deaths of his mother and foster mother, Edgar Allan Poe creates his own family. While staying with his aunt in Baltimore, he falls in love with her daughter, Virginia, his first cousin. When they marry, she is 13 years old. Poe worked as a critic and editor to support his new family, but his scathing reviews and erratic behavior created crisis after crisis.
Again and again in Poe's life, there are moments when Poe seems just on the verge of becoming a truly successful writer in an American sense, and the bottom falls out.
Poe uses the last of his savings to buy a piano for his beloved wife Virginia. One day, as she performs for her husband and mother, she begins to cough. It's the first sign of a disease that plagued Poe throughout his life and infected all those he loved. Virginia has TB. For the next 5 years, Virginia would waste away from the dreaded disease. The only ray of light was a poem Poe wrote while Virginia lay desperately ill. The Raven. It's a poem about a man's obsession for love lost to death. It was an immediate success.
The Raven was the first really big hit. It was something like, the Beatles for a song or something. It was enormously catchy. People apparently loved the way it sounded and the way it tripped along, and started imitating it all over the place.
Today, Poe's very name has become synonymous with the Raven. But even Poe's greatest success couldn't rescue him from poverty. Edgar Allan Poe dug into his own soul to write about the horror that touches each and every one of us.
If you have fear, then you're aware that you are vulnerable and you can do something about it, perhaps. If you don't have fear, you got to walk out in front of the saber-toothed tiger, in front of the Mack truck, and not be around for very long.
Edgar Allan Poe is the most psychological writer that ever lived. Yeah. There is nothing of his that he wrote that doesn't have a chord in you somewhere.
On January 30th, 1847, Edgar Allan Poe's wife, Virginia, died of tuberculosis. She was 24 years old. She died at the same age and of the same disease as Poe's mother.
Quite distracted by Virginia's death, he set off unaccountably on a journey to Philadelphia and Baltimore. On it, he appears to have begun drinking, he who could not take even a small amount of alcohol without being severely affected by it. He was next found lying in a street in Baltimore, suffering from an illness never quite defined, which within a few days had killed him.
Edgar Allan Poe's tales of terror were born out of a life filled with tragedy. And he used his suffering to create some of the most potent horror stories ever written.